Good, good. All right, so last week we talked a little bit about storytelling in general. Also went through just a bit of review here.
Mine's so small.
Also pointed out there's different ways to tell the story. Obvious example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John telling the same story in slightly different ways. We talked about the burning hearts, the disciples who were walking to Emmaus as Jesus opened their eyes to the scriptures and told the story of what was predicted about Jesus in both types and prophecies in the Old Testament. Their hearts burned within them. And we're hoping to try to recapture a little bit of that. The bullseye. Bullseye, there are, we just covered 14 of the over 100 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. We also talked a little bit about what does it mean to be justified, or as Ken said, just as if I'd never sinned. We also talked about the great swap where sinners, where the sins of the world go to Christ, and Christ in turn gives us his righteousness. We touched on Star Wars and the hero's journey, the template that the movie Star Wars was built on. And that led us to the quadlemma. When you're trying to make a decision about Jesus, when you're trying to tell the story about Jesus, there's basically four ways you can interpret the claims of Jesus about himself. Namely, is he a lunatic, a liar, a legend, or is he the Lord? And of course, we want to get past the idea that he's just a legend. I think that most of the skeptics will say, in some sense, that they'll try to go the legendary approach. They'll mix a little bit of truth and a little bit of legend. Of course, we want to proclaim him as Lord, as the truth, not a legend. So, are there any comments or observations from last week? Did anyone think about that, or even have a chance to tell the story? Anything at all?
Marsha?
Fire.
Yes.
No, I have a question on this.
Sure.
Are there any prophecies in the Old Testament that have not been fulfilled?
Oh, yes. Now, there is some debate about it, so I don't want to get too
Well, if
into
I'm
the
going to
debate.
say something about this, and they say, well, what about
Yes.
this and this, I want to be aware of what they're talking
Yes,
about.
okay, so there's a lot of ways we could go. I've heard that roughly 1/3 of the Bible is prophetic in nature. Quite a bit of it has already been fulfilled. Quite a bit of it, depending on who you talk to, has not been fulfilled. So I would say one of the things that I would watch out for is, if a Jehovah's Witness knocks on your door, and if you decide you want to tell them the story your way, while they're going to try to tell you the story their way, one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to talk to you about the kingdom, and they'll say, look, there's no heaven. You don't go to heaven when you die. You're going to have an earthly kingdom. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are very big on the earthly kingdom, and they have many prophecies that I would argue are not yet fulfilled in the Old Testament. The obvious ones are the lion will lay down with the lamb. The plowshares will be, swords will be beaten into plowshares. Nobody will train for war anymore. I think some of that's even included in the United Nations motto. So those are some of the prophecies I would argue have not been fulfilled, which we look forward to being fulfilled. The obvious one that's not controversial, that all Christians everywhere would agree with, is that Jesus is coming back someday, the second coming. So that's the obvious one. But I think it makes a difference. If I like talking to Jehovah's Witnesses when they knock on my door. That's one of the things. That's one of the things that they really excel at, and I think that they get. That they really confuse Christians with, is they will pull out all these prophecies out of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, that most of us, we don't really focus on, because it's not directly relevant to today, but it has future applicability. There may be other Christians who say, we think that if you soften it a little bit, that was already fulfilled maybe around AD 70 or so. So there is some debate among Christians. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Ken.
With regard to storytelling and
Yes.
sharing our testimony, I think our testimony is probably the most important thing we have because it's ours. You can't say it's not true. It has to be. And when you mentioned the cults, I've shared Christ with many witnesses, hymns of the Lord's warmth and so on. And the one thing about these precious people is they don't have a testimony for Christ. They have a testimony for church, program, the building they're in. That's all they've got. And so when we share Christ, it's the dynamite of God. And you mentioned that. So Romans 1:16, the gospel has power.
Did everyone hear that?
You're in the money.
Yes.
All in.
Yes, but we should remember that the good news is of the kingdom of God. What Jesus came preaching, and it will fill the whole earth. And so Jesus is coming to be King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and rule our nations, and to actually be here. And this is just we're ambassadors. Christ.
Ambassadors for Christ.
And then an ambassador is an emissary of another nation that's living in another nation. We're ambassadors for Christ in this present evil world.
What's that?
I did share my testimony with Jehovah's Witnesses who had come to the house, and after a while they asked if they could leave.
My head's up.
That's pretty good.
All right, so I want to tell you a quick story, a true story, about a time that my life almost changed very drastically. So I was minding my own business. Everything was ho-hum. I'm in my front yard, probably mowing my lawn. One of my neighbors drives past, waves like normal. I wave back. But then something changes. He kind of slams on the brakes as he passes the house, puts it in reverse, drives back up to where I'm at, and rolls down his window. So, okay, this is a little unusual. And he says, "Chris, I have the perfect job for you." So I start to wonder, is this my call to adventure? Now, at the time, I'm working with computers. I'm sitting at a desk in a cubicle. I'm kind of going through my midlife crisis, thinking, what have I really done with my life? Am I really contributing to the world? And so I'm keenly interested in what he has to say. Now, this is not your ordinary neighbor. This is he was actually the executive director of a missions organization named South American Mission. What he wanted to try to talk me into was becoming a missionary in the heart of Brazil, in Mato Grosso. As you can see, the very heart of Brazil, just south of the Amazon jungle, still ultimately part of the Amazon jungle. And he said that this job that's for you, it's a very special school that we have in Mato Grosso. Let me tell you a little bit more about Mato Grosso. So here I am. I'm at my desk in a cubicle, rethinking life. Now this area is a place of jungles and of waterfalls, of the largest snakes in the world. This is the anaconda. And to feed the largest snakes in the world, you also have the largest rodents in the world. So this is the capybara. And yes, I don't know why, but I just needed to show a monkey hitting a capybara. So these are the largest rodents in the world. Also, they have the giant anteater there. And then here's a not-so-giant anteater.
Okay.
Yes, giant tongue. Yeah. Oh, yes, giant anthills. All right, they also have jaguars. These are amazing creatures. They're at home up in the trees, on the jungle floor. They can even swim underwater. They can hunt underwater for 30 seconds at a time. They catch something underwater, they'll actually swallow it underwater. I've seen videos of it. Okay, it gets even weirder. These jaguars, they can out-crocodile the crocodiles. I kid you not. So this is a jaguar sneaking up out of the water to attack a caiman crocodile. And he wins. It's also a land of cowboys and Indians. Look at this cowboy. And look at this Indian. I love that picture. Of course, I shouldn't call them Indians. They're, indigenous tribes. They're not from India, of course. So there's some amazing Indian tribes in this area. The Zingu, the Kuijuro, the Kalapalo, many tribes. So you can see why I'd be intrigued. Such an interesting place that a best-selling book, The Lost City of Z, was based on a true story there. It was later turned into a movie. And so those are some true stories. There were also, based on these true stories, there were also some more fanciful stories that were also created, such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, that was partially inspired by this area. And even Disney's Up was partially inspired by The Lost World and this area as well. All right, so I was intrigued. This is the job for me. Tell me more. So my neighbor, he had lunch with him, and then I had lunch with one of the missionaries who works at this school. And he said, all right, we do several things. What we ultimately try to do is we're not allowed as missionaries to go out to the reservations in the Amazon. So we have to create a place where the indigenous tribesmen want to come to us. So they created this school. So these tribesmen voluntarily come to the school. They have a 3-year or a 5-year program. They get to learn basic Portuguese. Now, if you are a tribesman in Brazil, the thing that probably gives you more power, more self-sovereignty than anything is learning Portuguese, because then you can go to the capital city and represent your tribe. Otherwise, you don't really have much of a voice. So this is a big deal. They're giving them the Portuguese language, the basics of it. They do like basic typing, basic computer skills. But most of all, he said, we teach them stories of the Old and New Testament. And then he looked a little sheepish. He said, what we're aiming for, what we think of as missionary work, what we think of as church may not be what you think of as church. We have a different standard at the moment. What we think of as church is essentially this. We teach them the stories. We make sure that they get the stories right. And then they take their stories back to the tribe. And then around the campfire, in the village, they tell these stories. And then that's where the magic happens. And I had a big smile on my face. I thought this sounds great. So here's a map. These numbers show approximately the remaining Bible translation needs in the world today. So in the Americas, possibly 124 language groups may need scriptures to be translated. They've never heard the story. Europe, 58 languages. Isn't that surprising? Asia, 867. Africa, 706. So, telling the story, ultimately, I would love to see all languages of the world have a Bible in their language. But what I'm told by my friends at like Wycliffe Bible Translators and the Seed Company is that before we get into the translation work, we like to translate stories, because these pre-literate peoples are very story oriented. So they like to teach them the stories first, and then work on portions of the Old Testament, portions of the New Testament. All right, so it's not just pre-literate people that need stories. I think we post-literate people and we literate people also need stories. One of the reasons I say that, the average American spends more than 4 hours a week watching television shows, stories. That translates, by the time that average American turns age 65, that's 9 entire years that we've sat in front of the screen watching stories. All right, so Netflix. This was 2017. There were 1 billion hours spent watching Netflix by Netflix subscribers in 1 week. So apparently we need stories too. One of my thoughts is what does Paul say? Think about the things that are true, excellent, beautiful. All right, so here's a book called You Lost Me, Why Young Christians Are Leaving the Church and Rethinking Faith by David Kinnaman of the Barna Group. This kind of flows naturally for me. When I think about the time we spend, we Americans, spend watching television or cable or Netflix, I think, why are so many young people leaving the churches? Yes, Dan?
I think the biggest reason is hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy? I can't argue with that. Can't argue with that a bit. The statistics I've heard, these statistics are a little old, they might actually be worse now, is that about 4 out of 10 churchy kids who are raised in churches, who have a somewhat Christian background, 4 out of 10 will leave the church around their high school senior year or first or second year of college. Now, good news is, quite a bit of them will come back later. Why are so many young Christian kids leaving the Christian faith entirely? My statistic that I have to work with is 1 out of every 10. And I think some do eventually come back as well. And then here's another one. Why is our thinking changing so rapidly and so radically? We're just to think of, in my short life, just to think of all the changes from the 70s to the 80s to today, it's just an amazing change. So there's multiple reasons for this. Hypocrisy, I agree, that's totally one of them. And but I was listening to a podcast a week ago on my way to work, and I thought this offers a partial clue. So Kirby Anderson, he's out of Dallas. He also works with the Barna Group to gather some statistics. He says the typical high school senior will have, by the time he graduates, seen about 22,000 hours of television. They will probably have spent 11,000 hours in a classroom. They will probably have spent 11,000 hours listening to music. Almost 13,000 hours on the computer or smartphone. Contrast that with maybe a few hundred hours in church, and maybe a few hundred hours at most in the Bible. So you can see how the culture is really doing a very good job of conforming us to those particular ideas of the culture. Comments, questions, thoughts?
Agree.
Agree? All right. So, all right, I want to try a little experiment. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out. So I want to give some highlights of the life of Christ. Now, I don't want to actually tell the story. I want to give the building blocks, the raw materials. I want to provide a little skeleton, which you can put flesh on. And you will have already heard all this. This is more just to be a reminder. So it can either be a skeleton that you put flesh on, or a springboard. If there's some part of the story that catches your interest or sparks certain memories, I want you to focus on that. You can either focus on the big picture or try to focus on on a part. Either way, whatever works for you. Now I know 50 pieces is too much to juggle. It's too much for me to juggle. So again, this is just to spur thinking, to bring things back to our memories. All right, now I want to challenge you to be ready to tell that story in this classroom to one another today, soon. All right, this is so you can kind of think of it almost like a pop quiz. Now you have total freedom on this. Oh, there is one thing. This just came to me. I didn't make a slide out of this. It just kind of hit me when I was sitting over there a little while ago. One thing the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians, both chapter 1 and chapter 2, over and over he talks about the way he tells the story. He says, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel." And the gospel, of course, is the good story, the good tidings, the good news. "And not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power." All right, so he's not even looking to tell this story in an eloquent fashion. He wants to tell it in a way where the cross has power. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God. I'm skipping a bit. He says, for the Jews demand a sign, and the Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. This is a stumbling block to the Jews, and it is folly to the Gentiles. He also says to the Corinthians, and I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Which story to tell? Maybe try to focus on something cross and crucifixion centered. All right, so here we go. First building block, pre-existence in triunity. So it's not that Jesus began to exist when He was incarnated. He existed from eternity past, in communion with the Father and the Spirit. All right, Jesus actually creates our universe. I believe Philippians says that, Colossians. Jesus actually created, everything that was created by Jesus. All right, at some point, God the Father sends the Son to become one of us. Galatians 4:4. When the fullness of time had come, God sent His Son. As John 1 says, he tabernacled among us. He took on a tent, like as if the body is like a tent. Of course, the incarnation, the amazing thing, Jesus actually, when He becomes a man, He still remains God. He still has His God nature, but He somehow, mysteriously, empties Himself of His omnipotence, omniscience, those things that we normally associate with God. He voluntarily puts that aside and takes on finitude, the finitude of a human body. And as also takes the form of a servant. All right, there's a supernatural conception. When His mother Mary conceives, there's no man involved. And this is becoming a little less and less strange. Here's a little DNA helix. So there's a code here, and this code is so amazing that today we're just beginning to understand the code. We're beginning to be able to hack parts of the code, and it's just an amazing code. In fact, 3 years ago, it was determined there's actually a code embedded in the code. There's multiple layers of code. So this is amazing. And as a computer guy, when I see a code, I think, all right, this is an amazing code. Behind every amazing code is an amazing coder. And of course, this is an intelligent designer who we, of course, take to be God. Now, God who creates this code, these DNA strands, whenever cells multiply, the helix can unravel and then get reassembled as two. It's amazing. So it's not so weird to me to think that God could do this in a woman, such that there's no man needed. Of course, there's a census called, which brings Joseph and Mary back to Bethlehem, which was one of our prophecies in the bullseye, that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem. There are annunciations of His birth, the angels appearing to the wise men. The wise men seeing the star, angels appearing to the shepherds, a couple people, Anna in the temple. There's the flight to Egypt. The King Herod did his best to find out, all right, where is Messiah going to be born? Okay, he's from Bethlehem. Let's go kill all the baby boys 2 years and younger in Bethlehem. So Mary and Joseph are warned in a dream. Take flight to Egypt. There was a Jewish community in Egypt. Now, in Jesus' boyhood, now there's some fanciful stories, pure fiction, about how Jesus went to India when he was a teenager. Not true, not true. He for a few years, these are not in the Bible. These are total apocryphal stories. So what we know is that he grew up in Nazareth, even though born in Bethlehem, grew up in Nazareth, and he was a carpenter, which I'm thinking probably meant a little more working with stone than wood, but who knows? I wasn't there, so. Okay, now here, that's just an artist's depiction of Jesus at the temple at age 12, where he amazes the rabbis and the teachers of the law. So he's special. All right, fast forward a little bit. Jesus is baptized. There's some mystery here. I don't understand exactly why Jesus had to be baptized. I take heart in the fact that even John the Baptist was a little confused. Like, why should I baptize you? I mean, I'm not even qualified to untie your sandals or worthy of that. But it's a big deal because this was the time where God the Father and God the Spirit, God the Spirit descends like a dove. Oh yes, question.
Leading by example
Leading by example.
is how
I'm sure that fits into it. I think there's more, but I'd have trouble expounding it.
Well,
Yes.
we are conformed to his death and raised in life. Okay?
Good.
So that's good.
Conformed to his death and raised in his life. Yeah,
That's good. So, I mean, those
I'm leaning in that direction, and I think in some way he's identifying with sinful humanity. In fact, John the Baptist, when he introduces Jesus to the world, says, "Behold the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world." So there may be something there where, back in the great swap where Jesus takes our sins and we can take his righteousness, that there may be some tie here to the baptism.
Yeah, can I say one?
Yes, yes.
In coming up out of the water, Jesus Christ declared, Paul says, to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead, and this is a foretaste.
Definitely a foretaste of the resurrection from the dead, no doubt. Yeah. Anyway, this is a major thing. Oh, and then even God the Father, speaking from the heavens, says something to the effect of, "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased." So that's big. If I were considering following this wandering rabbi or not, it would mean a lot to me to hear the Father say such a thing. Okay, maybe I should follow him.
Yeah, God said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased."
With whom I'm well pleased.
Jesus had done nothing. He was pleased because he was the Son, and he loves us the same.
Nice. It's a big deal. Then there were the temptations. Now, these temptations are kind of interesting. I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but it seems like the three temptations that Jesus went through in the wilderness have some echoes to the temptations of Adam and Eve in the garden, and also to Israel in the 40 years where they were wandering in the wilderness. Just an interesting thought. Now there were miracles in Galilee. The first recorded miracle is turning the water into wine. Seems like there were some other miracles there too that weren't documented. So at this point, people are starting to realize, hey, this guy's special. He becomes an itinerant rabbi. When he goes to a synagogue, he's often invited to read from the scriptures and or give commentary. Not just anyone was asked to do that. Gathers 12 disciples, cleanses the temple with righteous indignation, overturning the tables of the money changers. At some point, even braids a whip. At some point, when he's in a synagogue in Nazareth, he announces his messiahship, reading Isaiah 61. Interestingly, he stops in the middle of a verse and says, "This has been fulfilled today," but doesn't finish the verse, which talks about a future prophecy that will be fulfilled by Jesus later. Stops in mid-verse. Okay, now this, we could talk for weeks about this. Miracles, signs, wonders. Now, anybody can claim to be a messenger of God. What if I claim to be a messenger? Hey, God gave me a message. Anybody can claim that, but can anybody prove it? Can you back it up? Now, Jesus backed it up. He was authenticated by miracles. He had the power of God to authenticate the fact that he had the message of God and that he was the messenger of God. Now, I heard somebody tell the story this way. He didn't just say, "Oh, Jesus worked miracles." The way he said it was, it just stuck in my memory. he demonstrated his authority over several things. He demonstrated that he is the Lord over diseases that we may suffer, including, people born blind, people born lame. Authority over disease, authority over nature, still calming the stormy skies and waters. Authority over demons. Authority to forgive sins, that's huge. That's, if he were just a man, that would be blasphemous. Authority over men, authority over tradition. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. Over grain, I think that fits in with one of the traditions. Even over interpretations of the law. So throughout the Gospels, he's showing his authority. Now he sends out the 12 at some point. He says, go to all the towns of Israel and tell them the kingdom is at hand. The king, I would say, the way I see it is, tell them the king is here, and it's time to accept or reject the king. And the 12 do. Now the 12 come back, and Jesus says, all right, so who do people say that I am? And the 12 report. They say, well, everybody's willing to accept you as a prophet. I mean, you do miracles, you say amazing things. You're obviously a prophet. Maybe on par with Jeremiah, maybe on par with John the Baptist or Elijah. Now, what they don't say is they say you're not on par with the prophet that Moses predicted. And remember, in our bullseye, Moses said, "There will be a prophet like me. Listen to him." So they're not willing to accept Jesus at that high level of this is like you're a prophet like Moses. So even though it sounds like an acceptance, they do accept him as a prophet. They don't accept him as the prophet, the anointed prophet. And they don't accept him as the king. So Mashiach is the anointed one, and that means three things. He's going to be the king of Israel, the ultimate king, the king of kings, the ultimate prophet, like Moses said, and the ultimate priest. So when he says, who do people say that I am? Ultimately, they're rejecting him as the king, the prophet, and the priest. That's the way I take it. A little time goes by. He's rejected by the leaders in Jerusalem and Judea. So he starts to focus more on the 12. Even his parables change. In the past, his parables, he would use parables so that everyone could understand him. But then after the rejection, it seems like when he starts speaking in parables, he does it to obfuscate it, to code it, so that not everyone can understand it. And then his disciples come to him, and he'll decode it for them. He'll say, here's how to understand that. So I think that's an interesting shift. That kind of, to me, fits in with the rejection aspect. Comes into conflict with the authorities in Jerusalem. Actually, on Palm Sunday, fulfilling a prophecy of Zechariah, enters Jerusalem, I think the east gate, on a colt, indicating that he's fulfilling that prophecy. He's basically saying, I am the Messiah, I am the king. And, here I am, I just said people rejected him. Well, they're putting palm fronds down, they're putting their cloaks down, they're cheering him on. So it's not a total rejection on the grassroots level. But of course, in the officials, he gets challenged by the priests, the elders, Pharisees, Herodians, Sadducees, Pharisees, and scribes. Oh, I mentioned Pharisees twice. Anyway, he actually gets challenged by the Pharisees at least twice. And at some point, Jesus, love this. Jesus springs all their traps. They try to trap him in his words while there's audiences listening. They want to make him look foolish. And he's just a master chess player. He's just the master logician. He just runs circles around them and springs their traps. And then at some point, while everyone's listening, he challenges them. And they can't answer. They're silenced. He silences his critics. I love that. At some point, Jesus actually weeps over Jerusalem. How, like a mother hen, I long to gather you under my wings, but you would not. He's weeping over them, and he ultimately passes judgment over them. But he also has plans to restore them in the future. He starts making predictions about the future, talking mainly about the 12, and his inner circle of disciples, and he may have had 40 or more people following him as well, not just the 12. I mean, obviously, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, they were in that group too. Starts making preparations for his death. He knows what's going to happen. His disciples are a little slow. They don't quite get it. Prays for all believers and disciples. Of course, he's arrested, goes through different civil trials, religious trials. He's scourged and crucified. Again, remember Paul saying, I sought to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. While he's on the cross, one of the last things he does is he tells John, the youngest disciple, to take care of his mother. Then he says, it is finished, tetelestai, which seems to be a part of a legal economic transaction, saying the debt is paid. That seems to be, there's some debate about what this means, but whatever it means, it's finished. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. Ultimately, no one takes his life from him. He gives his own life up. After he dies, there are wonders that happen. Darkness for 3 hours during the daytime. Not just a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, because this is 3 hours long. 3 hours of darkness at that timing. The earth shakes. Rocks are split open. Tombs are split open. The temple veil, that which separates humans from God, is torn. Wow, that's got to be serious, profound implications there. And then at some point in those 3 days, certain saints in Jerusalem that had died are raised from the dead. They actually walk back into Jerusalem. They're seen, they're recognized, and that's got to make people say, okay, something interesting.
People that were known to them.
People that were known to them.
Could
Right.
have been someone, I'm
Right.
Abraham, okay, so that's-
Right, yeah, presumably people that are known.
Known and known
Yeah.
to be dead.
Right, yeah. Again, I don't know who they were, but this would definitely get my attention. Of course, then the resurrection, the body is gone, and he starts appearing to certain people. Appears to the women first, and then to the disciples. Eventually, Thomas is like, "Yeah, I don't believe what you crazy people are saying. Until I see him with my own eyes. I need to be able to reach out and touch his wounds." Interesting. In the Bible, Thomas never gets to the point. Jesus says, "Yeah, go ahead and touch my wounds," and Thomas actually never does. He just sort of wilts and says, "My Lord and my God." Okay. All right, good. Okay, so you got lucky this time. I was going to have you turn to someone near you and tell the story.
Save the bell.
But we won't do that.
Just like class.
But I will give you homework instead. All right, so your homework is find someone. Doesn't matter who. This is all about practice. Practice telling the story. So could be a grandkid. Hey, grandkid, get off the televisions or get off your smartphone. Here, I want to practice telling you a story, and if you need to, use me as an excuse. Say, look, my Sunday school teacher told me I got to practice telling the story. So, and again, it's up to you how you want to do it. Try, big picture story. Try little picture story. Try a mixture of the two. Totally up to you. And no, you won't be graded on this. So, thank you guys. Thank you all.
Thank you.